In the spring of 1873, a 54-year-old newspaper editor from Milwaukee sat down at a small table and wrote a letter to a friend. He was tired. He had spent the last 7 years of his life on a single invention, a strange machine that sat on a table, the size of a kitchen counter, a tangle of brass rods and wooden keys that looked like, in his own words, a cross between a piano and a sewing machine. He had nearly gone bankrupt building it. He had been mocked in his own city. He had been told more than once that he should give up. But on that day in 1873, sitting in his small office in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Christopher Latham Sholes wrote a single line that captured everything he had hoped his invention might do. He wrote that he did feel he had done something for the women who had always had to work so hard. This will enable them more easily to earn a living. He was right. He had no idea how right he was. In 1870, only 2.5% of clerical workers in the United States were women. By 1930, that number was over 52%. Tens of millions of American women would, over the next 60 years, walk into offices, banks, government buildings, hospitals, and newspapers across this country and begin earning their own wages, controlling their own income, and standing on their own feet for the first time in American history. And almost every one of them would do it sitting in front of a Sholes typewriter. This is the story of the most quietly revolutionary American invention of the 19th century. The story of a Wisconsin newspaperman who never made much money from his own invention. The story of how a small workshop in Milwaukee changed the lives of more American women than any single piece of legislation ever passed. And the story of a humble inventor who, near the end of his life, said the only thing he was really proud of was what his machine had done for working women. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button for more hidden histories of everyday objects. Christopher Latham Sholes was born in 1819 in Mooresburg, Pennsylvania, in a small farmhouse along the Susquehanna River. He was the kind of American who came up the hard way. His family did not have much money. He left school as a teenager and apprenticed himself to a local printer, learning to set type by hand, one letter at a time. By the time he was 18, he had moved west to the new territory of Wisconsin, taking a job at his older brother's newspaper in Green Bay. He spent the next 30 years working as a newspaperman. He edited the Wisconsin Inquirer in Madison. He ran the newspaper in Kenosha. He served as a state legislator. He became editor of the Milwaukee News, and later, the Milwaukee Sentinel. And in 1861, when Abraham Lincoln became president, Sholes was appointed collector of the Port of Milwaukee, a quiet, well-paying government job that gave him plenty of free time to do what he really loved. He loved tinkering. In the back room of a small machine shop on State Street in Milwaukee, owned by a man named C.F. Klein Stoiber, Sholes spent his evenings building small mechanical devices, a page numbering machine, a device for printing tickets, little machines that printers and newspapers might find useful. He patented some of them. None of them made him rich. But in 1867, when Sholes was 48 years old, a fellow tinkerer named Carlos Glidden walked into the back room of Klein Stoiber's shop holding a copy of Scientific American magazine. Glidden pointed to an article. The article described a primitive writing machine built by an English inventor named John Pratt. It was slow. It was clumsy. It did not really work. But it was, according to Pratt, the future, a machine that would one day let people write as fast as they could speak. Glidden looked at Sholes and asked, "Why don't you build something better?" That was the moment that changed American history. Sholes had no idea at the time what he was starting. He simply nodded, took the magazine home, and began thinking about the problem. He spoke to his friend Samuel Soule. He sketched designs on paper. Within a few weeks, the three of them, Sholes, Soule, and Glidden, had agreed to work together on the project at Kleinsteuber's shop. They had no idea that this would consume the rest of Sholes' working life. The challenges were enormous. Earlier attempts at typewriters had failed for the same reasons. The machines were too large, sometimes as big as a piano. The mechanisms were too delicate and broke under normal use. The keys jammed constantly. The print was uneven. And worst of all, each machine was slower than writing by hand with a pen. Sholes spent the summer of 1867 in Kleinsteuber's machine shop, working alongside a skilled German mechanic named Matthias Schwalbach. Their first prototype was almost laughably crude. It was a small wooden frame with a glass plate on top, a single brass rod sticking up from below, and a Morse telegraph key protruding from the side. When the telegraph key was pressed, the brass rod swung up, struck the glass plate, and printed a single letter onto a piece of carbon paper. The letter it printed was always W. It typed only the letter W over and over. But the demonstration was enough. Sholes' friend Charles Weller, a Western Union operator who came to watch the first test, was astonished. He could see, even in that crude device, what Sholes was reaching for: a machine that could write. By the fall of 1867, Sholes and his partners had built a much better version. It typed all 26 letters. The keys were arranged in alphabetical order like a piano's keys, all on a single, long, flat row. On June 23, 1868, they received their first United States patent for what they called a typewriting machine. It was a beautiful, hopeful moment. And almost immediately afterward, everything began to go wrong. The typewriter that Sholes had patented did not actually work very well. The alphabetical key arrangement was a problem. When typists pressed two adjacent letters quickly, say S and T or A and B, the metal arms inside the machine would collide and jam. The faster you typed, the worse the jamming got. Some of the most common letter combinations in English involved keys placed right next to each other on the keyboard, and the entire machine would seize up every few seconds. Sholes' partners began to lose faith. Samuel Soule sold his share of the patent and walked away. Carlos Glidden held on for a while longer, then he too began to drift toward other projects. By 1870, Sholes was nearly alone in believing the project could be saved. He turned to a man named James Densmore. Densmore was a Pennsylvania oil boom investor who had made a small fortune building tank cars to transport crude petroleum. He was a brusque, demanding, restless man, but he believed in Sholes. He bought into the typewriter project and began funding it personally, sending Sholes a steady stream of letters demanding faster progress, better performance, more sales. Sholes worked. He worked through 1870, 1871, and 1872. He built dozens of prototypes. He tested hundreds of configurations of the keyboard. And in 1873, he made a discovery that would, more than any other single decision, define the next 150 years of human typing. He rearranged the keys. Sholes asked his son-in-law, an educator, to do a simple study. Which letter combinations appeared most frequently in the English language? Which pairs of letters did typists hit most often, one after the other, in normal writing? His son-in-law produced a list. Sholes then went to his keyboard and deliberately separated those common letter pairs. He moved the most used combinations to opposite sides of the keyboard so that the metal arms inside the machine would not collide. He scattered the letters in a way that, at first glance, looked completely random. But it was not random. It was a careful engineering solution to a mechanical problem. The result was the keyboard layout we still use today. QWERTY. 6 letters in the top left corner of the keyboard you are looking at right now on your phone or computer or laptop in nearly every English-speaking country on Earth. A keyboard layout designed in 1873 in a Milwaukee workshop to solve a problem that has not existed for over a century. And yet a layout that every American child still learns, that every job application is filled out on, that every email and text message is typed on, more than 150 years after Christopher Latham Sholes made the decision. The QWERTY keyboard is one of the longest-lived design decisions in modern American history, and it solved the jamming problem. In 1873, with a working typewriter finally in his hands, Sholes did something that, by the standards of American invention, was unusual. He sold the patent. He was tired. He was nearly broke. He had been working on the typewriter for almost 7 years. James Densmore had been pushing for years to find a manufacturer who could produce the machine at scale, and Densmore had finally found one, the Remington Arms Company of Ilion, New York. Remington had built rifles for the Union Army during the Civil War. After the war, they had retooled their factory to produce sewing machines and farm tools. They were willing to take on one more product. Sholes accepted $12,000 for his patent rights. It was a modest sum, even by the standards of 1873. It was not enough to make him wealthy. It was certainly not enough to compensate him for 7 years of obsessive work. But Sholes accepted it without complaint. By his own account, he was relieved. He was not a businessman. He was a tinkerer who had finished his tinkering. What he did not know was that the man who had bought his patent, and what came next, would change America. The first Remington typewriter rolled off the assembly line in September of 1874. It was called the Sholes and Glidden typewriter in honor of its inventors. It was painted with elaborate floral decorations designed to look like a domestic appliance, almost like a sewing machine, to ease the discomfort of Victorian-era customers who were not yet sure what a typewriter even was. It cost $125. That was, in 1874, an enormous amount of money. For most American households, it was the equivalent of nearly a year's wages. Sales were terrible. In the first 3 years, Remington sold only a few thousand machines. Most Americans simply could not imagine why anyone would need one. The handwriting of a respectable American gentleman was considered an art form, an extension of his personality. A letter written on a machine was widely regarded as cold, impersonal, even insulting. One newspaper editor refused a typewritten manuscript from a contributor, scribbling across the top, "Do not send me machine-written letters. They are evidence that the writer thinks me unworthy of his personal hand." It seemed, by 1877, that the typewriter might quietly fail, and then something began to change. This is where the story turns. In the late 1870s, American offices were undergoing a transformation that most history books almost completely ignore. The country was getting bigger, faster, more commercial. The Civil War had ended a decade earlier, and in its aftermath, American business had exploded. Railroads were stitching the country together. Telegraph lines connected every major city. The number of banks, insurance companies, law firms, shipping companies, and government offices was growing every year. And all of those offices were drowning in paperwork. In 1870, the typical American office was a strange and almost medieval place. It was staffed entirely by men. They were called clerks. They wrote everything by hand, using fountain pens dipped in ink on heavy ledger paper. They copied documents by writing them out a second time, by hand, often a third or a fourth time. They sat on tall stools at slanted writing desks, just as their grandfathers had done. By 1880, the system was breaking under its own weight. There was simply too much paper, too many letters, too many contracts, too many invoices. American business was growing faster than the supply of male clerks who could be hired to write everything down. And the male clerks who did exist, they expected promotions, raises, eventual partnerships, careers. They were expensive. Offices needed help. And then someone, somewhere, possibly at the YWCA in New York City, which began offering typing classes to young women in 1881, realized something. The typewriter did not require a strong arm. It did not require height or physical labor. It did not require any prior office experience. It required only the ability to read, the ability to spell, and the patience to learn the keyboard. In other words, it required exactly the skills that millions of young American women already had. The country, in 1880, was full of literate young women with nowhere to use their literacy. They had been educated in public schools. They had read and written for years, but the only respectable jobs available to them were teaching, nursing, domestic service, or factory work. Factory work was dangerous, exhausting, and brutally underpaid. The typewriter changed that overnight. By 1881, the New York YWCA was offering typing classes. By 1885, advertisements for typewriters had stopped showing men at the keyboard entirely. The image in every Remington advertisement, every catalog, every poster was now a young woman in a white blouse, hair pulled back, fingers poised over the keys. The typewriter was, in the American imagination, a woman's machine. The numbers tell the story. In 1870, only 2.5% of American clerical workers were women. In 1880, just 4%. By 1900, that number had jumped to over 40%. By 1930, more than half of all clerical workers in the United States were women, and the total number of clerical jobs had grown from a few 100,000 to several million. In 60 years, the typewriter had created an entirely new American workforce. It was made up almost entirely of women. They were called typewriter girls at first, a phrase that referred both to the machine and to the woman operating it. They worked in banks and insurance companies and government offices. They earned, on average, $10 to $15 a week, which was, in 1890, enough for a single young woman to live independently in a city, pay her own rent, eat her own meals, and answer to nobody. For the first time in American history, millions of women had their own income. They did not have to marry to survive. They did not have to depend on a father or a brother for shelter and food. They were not factory workers, breaking their bodies in dangerous mills. They were office workers, in clean buildings, in good clothes, doing skilled professional labor, and they were earning a real wage for doing it. The cultural shift that followed was enormous. In 1900, the census recorded that 96% of women clerical workers in America were unmarried, single young women who had moved to cities to find work, who lived in boarding houses and walk-up apartments, who supported themselves entirely on their typewriter wages. These were the great-grandmothers of the modern American middle class, the first generation of American women to live by choice as independent adults. None of it would have happened without Christopher Latham Sholes. By the time the typewriter became truly successful, Sholes himself had largely faded from public view. He continued to tinker. He patented a few small improvements. He never grew wealthy from his invention. The Remington Arms Company made a fortune. The investors made a fortune. The men who bought and sold typewriter patents in the 1880s and the 1890s made fortunes. Sholes did not. He lived modestly in Milwaukee on his small government pension and the modest royalties from his later improvements. He developed tuberculosis in the late 1880s and grew weaker year by year. And on February 17, 1890, 3 days after his 71st birthday, Christopher Latham Sholes died in his small Milwaukee home surrounded by his family. He was buried in Forest Home Cemetery in Milwaukee, beneath a modest gravestone that does not even mention the typewriter. But near the end of his life, when a friend asked him what he was most proud of, Sholes did not point to the QWERTY keyboard or the Remington contract or the millions of machines that had been sold around the world. He said simply that he was proud of what his invention had done for women. He was right to be proud. By 1930, 4 decades after his death, more than 2 million American women were earning their own wages in offices across the country. By 1950, that number had passed 5 million. By 1970, women in clerical work outnumbered men in clerical work by nearly 6 to 1. The American office, which had been an entirely male institution in 1870, had become almost entirely a place where women worked. Today, the global market for office equipment and software descended from Sholes' original typewriter is worth over $300 billion a year. Every email you send, Every document you draft, every text message you type on a phone uses a keyboard layout designed in a small Milwaukee workshop in 1873 by a tired old newspaper man who only wanted to help working women earn a living. He was the most consequential American inventor that almost nobody remembers. So when you sit down tomorrow to type something, a letter, an email, a text to a family member, a quick note for work, remember what you are using. You are using a Wisconsin newspaperman's gift, a machine designed to give working women a way to stand on their own feet. A keyboard arranged 150 years ago in a small workshop on State Street in Milwaukee. And a piece of American history that opened the door to the most important economic transformation in this country's social life. Quietly, gently, one young woman at her typewriter at a time. From a Pennsylvania apprentice printer who worked his way to Wisconsin, to a small shop on State Street in Milwaukee, to the tens of millions of American women who built their lives one keystroke at a time. Every invention has a hidden past, and sometimes the most ordinary objects have the most extraordinary stories. If you enjoyed uncovering the hidden story behind this everyday object, hit subscribe, drop a comment with what you'd like to hear about next, and tap that like button. Now take a look around. History is everywhere.